Time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Kamlager-Dove. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much for always pronouncing my name correctly. So many of my colleagues across the aisle have discussed increasing our dependence on fossil fuels, and all of our districts are impacted by the effects of climate change 12 months out of the year, as well as our dependence on fossil fuels. I don't think science cares if you're a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent. My diverse, largely Black and brown district is home to one of the largest oil fields in the country. Instead of working to bring environmental justice to communities such as mine who have been negatively impacted by our dependence on fossil fuels, we are discussing expanding the practices that have caused serious health problems for these communities. Ms. Johnson, I have a question for you. We know that pollution in all its forms has an unacceptable and disproportionate burden on Black and low-income communities like those in my district. Although one of my colleagues just yesterday from across the aisle said that because the Black population is so small, it doesn't matter if we are killed by pollution. Whites and Cajuns are of greater concern. With all due respect, I think Black people are important, and Black and low-income communities are forced to continue to bear the brunt of a changing climate, from heat islands and drought to difficulty obtaining disaster assistance. Now our colleagues are pushing for even more fossil fuel development that would only add to these risks and potentially kill more of us. So could you answer how this would impact vulnerable communities across the country?
Sure. I first want to note, I do believe that the White House Council on Environmental Quality is the lead agency around NEPA. I think it's important for us to be sure that their contributions to the rulemaking process is acknowledged. So to answer your question, I think in every stage of oil and gas life cycle, from extraction to distribution, there are negative impacts on communities across the U.S. As I noted earlier, because of redlining and other land use decisions, we most feel that in places where people of color and people of low income live. I think specifically environmental justice communities are a part of that process. We experience water contamination during the refinement and distribution of oil and gas. Toxic pollutants are emitted into our air, and all of the health impacts that I noted earlier are a part of that. And so I think that we need to ensure that we aren't continuing to perpetuate those disproportionate harms. We need to look at how we equitably and justly transition our energy economy in a way that is affordable, but also is done at a pace where, frankly, people feel comfortable that they do have family sustaining wages, that they do have their credentials and their education considered in setting labor standards and wage opportunities. We need to be sure that we are preserving people's pensions and things so that that transition occurs in a meaningful way. So I think I'll stop there. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, you did. Thank you. And a question was asked about where the NEPA process was not followed. I think you said there were 12 projects where it wasn't. I have a little bit of time. Would you like to share what some of those projects are and what can be done to help them do what they're supposed to do?
Sure. I think what I wanted to offer up is when the NEPA process was not followed, the federal requirements were not followed. We saw places like oil and gas leases in New Mexico for the San Juan Basin not consider climate impacts in the NEPA process, and that slowed it down. When we look at a federal coal moratorium in California, not taking into account NEPA analysis slowed down that project's process. When we look at leases in Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, inadequate NEPA processes that did not consider greenhouse gas emissions from drilling and downstream use slowed down projects. We see more of this in different places across the country. When we don't follow our process, we delay projects. The framework is not the delay.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.